It was the kind of day Mark had always dreamt of, a sunny afternoon where everything seemed perfect. He stood in the living room, admiring the wedding invitations that lay scattered on the dining table. In just a few short days, he would marry Samantha, the woman who had brought light back into his life after years of raising his son, Jordan, alone. Mark couldn't help but feel proud. After all the struggles he had faced as a single father, he believed he finally found happiness again. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Jordan, his 13-year-old son, sat quietly at the kitchen table, absently flipping through a comic book. His eyes didn't light up with excitement when he talked about the wedding, and his responses were brief whenever Mark mentioned Samantha. In fact, for the past few months, Jordan had been growing more distant, his once cheerful demeanor replaced by an odd sense of unease. Mark chalked it up to normal teenage behavior. He assumed that Jordan just needed time to adjust to the idea of having a new woman in their lives, a new family dynamic. Samantha, after all, had been nothing but kind and caring to Jordan, at least in Mark's eyes. She was charming, elegant, and supportive of Mark's career. But Jordan had always been quiet whenever she was around, and lately that quietness seemed to stretch into something deeper, like a storm gathering in silence. One evening, as the wedding day drew closer, Mark sat down with Jordan for what he hoped would be an honest talk. "You know, buddy," Mark began, "the wedding is going to be a big day for all of us. Samantha really cares about you, and I want us to be a family. Is there something you want to talk about? Something bothering you?" Jordan hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window as if he could find the right words out there. "I don't know, Dad," he muttered. "It just doesn't feel right." Mark sighed. "What doesn't feel right? The wedding, Samantha." Jordan looked up then, his expression serious for a boy his age. "Yeah, her. There's something about her. I don't trust her." The words hit Mark like a bucket of cold water. He was expecting reluctance, maybe some jealousy or hesitation, but this? His son's distrust of the woman he was about to marry. Mark didn't want to hear it. He couldn't. "Jordan, I know it's been hard for you since your mom passed, but Samantha's a good person. She makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" Jordan remained silent, his fingers gripping the edges of his comic book tightly, as if it was the only thing anchoring him in the moment. Mark tried to push the discomfort away, but Jordan's words lingered in the back of his mind, casting a shadow over the upcoming celebration. As the wedding preparations kicked into high gear, Jordan's unease only grew. He noticed things no one else seemed to, things that bothered him deeply. Samantha's behavior shifted when his father wasn't around. When Mark was in the room, she was all smiles, laughter, and sweetness. But when it was just Jordan and Samantha, she became distant, cold, even. There were moments when her mask slipped, and Jordan caught glimpses of someone entirely different. One night, when Mark was working late, Jordan overheard a conversation between Samantha and a man he had never seen before. He had been playing video games in his room when he heard voices coming from the living room. Curious, Jordan crept down the hallway and peeked around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. Samantha was standing by the front door, talking to a man in a suit, her tone hushed but tense. "I'm doing everything I can," Samantha whispered harshly. "Just a few more days, and it will all be over. Once the wedding is done, we can proceed as planned." The man nodded, his face stern. "It better be worth it. We've come too far to let a kid mess things up." Jordan's breath caught in his throat. He ducked back into the shadows, his mind racing. What were they talking about? What was going to happen after the wedding? He wanted to barge in, confront her, but fear held him back. He knew something was wrong, but without proof, what could he say? Who would believe him? From that moment on, Jordan became a silent observer in his own home, watching Samantha's every move with suspicion. He noticed how she seemed to manipulate conversations to her advantage, always steering his father's attention away from him. She was skilled at controlling the narrative, always making herself look innocent and likable while subtly isolating Jordan. It was like she was planting seeds of doubt between him and his father, making Jordan feel increasingly alone. Mark, meanwhile, was too busy with work and wedding preparations to notice. To him, Samantha was still the perfect partner, and any issues Jordan had were just part of the growing pains of accepting a new family member. Mark trusted Samantha implicitly, and that trust blinded him to the warning signs that Jordan was now desperately trying to piece together. As the days passed, Jordan became more and more anxious. The wedding was fast approaching, and he felt like time was running out. His father was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and Jordan was the only one who could stop it. But how? He was just a kid. How could he convince his father to see what he saw, to believe that the woman he loved was hiding something dangerous? The pressure weighed heavily on Jordan's shoulders. He couldn't sleep at night, his mind spinning with thoughts of what might happen if Samantha went through with her plans. He didn't know exactly what those plans were, but he knew they involved his father, and it wasn't good. Jordan's behavior started to change. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his room, researching ways to uncover someone's hidden past. He started looking into Samantha's life, digging through her social media profiles and searching for any clues that might confirm his suspicions. But Samantha was careful. There was little to find, at least on the surface. That is, until Jordan stumbled upon something that made his heart stop. Late one night, while his father was asleep, Jordan discovered an old news article about a woman involved in a financial scam a few states away. The woman in the grainy photo looked eerily similar to Samantha. Different hair color, different style, but the same face. The article described a series of frauds and cons targeting wealthy men, leaving them financially ruined. The woman had vanished before she could be caught, leaving no trace behind. Jordan stared at the screen, his heart hammering in his chest. Could it really be her? Was Samantha planning to do the same thing to his father? He couldn't be sure, but the evidence was mounting, and the clock was ticking. Determined, Jordan made a decision. He needed to find out more, much more, before the wedding day arrived. Time was running out, and if he didn't act soon, it might be too late to save his father from the web of lies Samantha had spun. As he sat in the darkness of his room, his computer screen casting a pale glow across his face, Jordan made a silent vow. No matter what, he would stop this wedding. He just had to find the proof, and fast. This was only the beginning, but Jordan knew the storm was coming. Jordan could barely sleep after finding the article that bore a striking resemblance to Samantha's dark past. Every time he closed his eyes, images of his father's life being ruined flashed before him. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became to uncover the truth. He was sure now. Samantha wasn't who she claimed to be, and it was up to him to expose her before the wedding day. The next morning, while his father was still at work, Jordan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, carefully combing through every detail he could find about the woman in the article. The article mentioned a series of financial frauds, but what stood out to Jordan was how the con artist had targeted wealthy men, manipulated their trust, and disappeared with their money. The fact that Samantha fit the description almost too perfectly made his stomach churn. The timing, the charm, the secrecy, it all lined up with what he had been seeing over the past few months. His hands trembled as he scrolled through page after page of information, hoping to find something that would confirm his worst fears. There were other victims mentioned in the article, but no concrete leads as to the woman's current whereabouts. Jordan's gut told him that Samantha had changed her identity and moved on to a new target, his father. But without solid proof, his father would never believe him. Mark was too blinded by his love for Samantha to see the danger right in front of him. Jordan had to dig deeper. He had to find something undeniable, something that would force his father to wake up before it was too late. That afternoon, while Mark was running errands for the wedding, Jordan saw his opportunity. Samantha had gone out for a last-minute fitting, leaving the house empty except for Jordan. He knew it was risky, but desperate times called for desperate measures. If he was going to stop this wedding, he had to act fast. With his heart pounding, Jordan made his way into Samantha's bedroom. He had never been in there before, Samantha kept her personal life locked down, and even his father seemed to give her space. But Jordan was on a mission now. He needed to find any evidence of Samantha's real identity, anything that could connect her to the woman in the article. He carefully opened her drawers, his hands shaking as he sifted through clothing, papers, and random items. For a moment, it felt wrong, invasive, but he reminded himself that he was doing this to protect his father. Samantha's meticulous organization made it difficult to find anything out of place, but Jordan kept searching. He moved to the closet, scanning the shelves for anything unusual. At first, there was nothing, just shoes, handbags, and expensive clothing. But then, behind a pile of old scarves, he found a small, locked box. His pulse quickened. A locked box hidden in the back of a closet. That had to mean something. Jordan frantically looked around the room, searching for a key. After a few tense minutes, he found a small key tucked in the pocket of one of Samantha's jackets hanging in the closet. His hands shook as he turned the key in the lock and opened the box. Inside, there were a few envelopes and documents. Jordan's eyes widened when he saw what was inside the first envelope. A different driver's license with Samantha's picture, but under a different name, Rebecca Myers. His heart raced as he went through the rest of the documents, finding multiple IDs, each with Samantha's face, but under different aliases. There were credit cards in different names, and more importantly, a passport that bore the same name as the con artist from the article, Rebecca Myers. Jordan's suspicions had been confirmed. Samantha, no Rebecca, had been running a long con, and his father was her latest victim. But it didn't stop there. Among the documents, Jordan found detailed records of his father's financials, bank accounts, property ownership, retirement funds. His father had trusted her completely, and Samantha, or Rebecca, had taken full advantage of it. She'd had accessed everything, and if they got married, she would likely drain it all. Jordan's blood boiled with rage. How could his father not see this? How could he not realize that the woman he was about to marry was a fraud? Jordan clutched the documents tightly, his mind spinning with the realization of what needed to be done. He had to stop the wedding, no matter what it took. He quickly took photos of all the documents with his phone, making sure to capture every detail. If his father refused to believe him, these photos would serve as undeniable proof. Jordan felt a surge of determination as he returned everything to its place, locking the box and pulling it back where he had found it. Just as he was about to leave the room, he heard the front door open. His heart stopped. Samantha was home early. Jordan froze in place, his mind racing. He couldn't let her find him in her room. It would be impossible to explain. He quietly closed the closet door and tiptoed toward the bedroom door, praying that Samantha wouldn't come upstairs. From downstairs, he heard her humming to herself, seemingly unaware of his presence. Jordan slipped out of her room as quietly as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He made it to his own room just in time, shutting the door behind him and collapsing onto his bed, trying to calm his racing heartbeat. A few minutes later, there was a knock on his door. "Jordan," Samantha's voice called out. "Are you home?" Jordan forced himself to stay calm. "Yeah, I'm here," he called back, trying to sound casual. Samantha's footsteps grew closer. "Your dad's running late, but I'm making dinner. Want to come down?" "I'll be there in a minute," Jordan replied, doing his best to keep his voice steady. He listened as her footsteps retreated down the hallway, and only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. He had done it. He had the proof he needed. But now came the hard part, confronting his father and convincing him to cancel the wedding. Later that evening, when his father came home, Jordan considered telling him everything right then and there. But as soon as he saw the happiness in Mark's eyes, the excitement in his voice as he talked about the wedding, Jordan hesitated. He knew his father wouldn't believe him, not without undeniable proof, and maybe not even then. Instead, Jordan decided to bide his time. He would wait until the moment when it would be impossible for Samantha to lie her way out. He would reveal everything at the wedding, in front of everyone, where there would be no escaping the truth. Over the next few days, Jordan acted normal around his father and Samantha, though the tension was unbearable. He pretended everything was fine, but inside, he was preparing for the biggest confrontation of his life. He spent hours reviewing the evidence he had collected, going over what he would say when the time came. The day before the wedding, Mark sat down with Jordan for one final heart-to-heart. "You know, son, I've been thinking about what you said," Mark began, his tone softer than usual, "about not trusting Samantha. I just want you to know that I'm marrying her because I love her, and I believe she'll be a great stepmom for you." Jordan's heart sank as his father spoke. He knew Mark's heart was in the right place, but he was blind to the truth. "Dad," Jordan said, his voice steady, "I know you love her, but tomorrow I'm going to show you something that will change everything. You just have to trust me, okay?" Mark frowned, confused by his son's words. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," Jordan replied, his expression serious. "Just promise me you'll listen." Mark stared at his son for a long moment before nodding. "I promise." Jordan felt a glimmer of hope. He had one shot to stop the wedding, and he wasn't going to waste it. The stage was set. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The wedding day dawned bright and early, with a crisp blue sky and a sense of excitement in the air. Mark was bustling around the house, checking last-minute details and making sure everything was in place for the ceremony. The venue was booked, the guests were confirmed, and Samantha was preparing herself at a nearby salon. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of joy, as if all the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. But for Jordan, it was the most nerve-wracking day of his life. He sat quietly in his room, staring at the photos on his phone, the evidence he had gathered in secret. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the images once more, the different IDs, the bank accounts, the credit cards, and the undeniable truth that Samantha was not who she claimed to be. It was all there, staring back at him like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. Jordan knew what he had to do. He had to reveal the truth, and there was no turning back now. But as the minutes ticked closer to the wedding, a gnawing doubt began to creep into his mind. Would his father believe him? Would the guests think he was just a kid making baseless accusations? What if Samantha managed to twist the situation in her favor, manipulating his father into thinking Jordan was just acting out? He couldn't let that happen. Taking a deep breath, Jordan steeled himself. Today wasn't just about stopping a wedding. It was about saving his father from a lifetime of heartache and potential ruin. He had uncovered Samantha's, or rather Rebecca's, dark past, and now it was time to expose it to the world. The house buzzed with pre-wedding energy as guests began arriving. Dressed in their finest attire, they mingled in the living room and the backyard, chatting about the big event. Jordan kept a low profile, blending into the background as he watched the happy chaos unfold. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing that everything would change soon. Mark approached Jordan with a beaming smile, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo. "Ready for the big day, son?" he asked, giving Jordan a light pat on the back. Jordan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Dad, I'm ready." Mark glanced at his son, sensing the tension but not understanding its depth. "You're still nervous about everything, huh? It'll be fine. Samantha is going to make both of our lives better, I promise." Jordan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the evidence burning in his pocket. "I know, Dad. I'll be there when it matters." Mark, still oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, gave Jordan a nod and disappeared into the crowd of guests, greeting old friends and family members. Jordan watched him go, feeling a pang of sadness. He wished he didn't have to do this in such a public way, but he had no choice. Samantha was a master manipulator, and the only way to break her facade was to confront her in front of everyone. The ceremony was set to take place in the garden behind the house, under an arch of roses that Mark had arranged with meticulous care. As the final touches were being added, Jordan took a deep breath and prepared himself mentally. He had hidden the photos in his jacket pocket and rehearsed what he would say 1,000 times over in his head. The plan was simple: Wait until the moment when Mark and Samantha were about to exchange vows, and then step forward with the truth. As the guests made their way to their seats in the garden, Jordan stood off to the side, watching everything unfold with a sense of quiet dread. The officiant took his place at the front, and the soft strains of classical music floated through the air as everyone waited for the bride to appear. Jordan's heart raced. He knew that in just a few minutes, everything would change. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Samantha appeared at the entrance to the garden, walking down the aisle in an elaborate white gown, her smile radiant as she approached Mark, who stood at the front, waiting for her with a look of pure adoration. Jordan's stomach churned. He watched as the woman who had been deceiving his father for months glided toward him, her every step a calculated move in her intricate web of lies. The ceremony began, and the officiant spoke the usual words of love and commitment, though Jordan could barely hear them over the sound of his own heartbeat. His eyes never left Samantha's face. He studied her every move, waiting for the right moment to act. Then it came, the moment when the officiant turned to Mark and Samantha and asked them to exchange their vows. Jordan's heart pounded in his ears. This was it. He couldn't wait any longer. Before Mark could speak his first word, Jordan stepped forward from the sidelines, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Dad, stop." A murmur rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward Jordan. Mark looked confused, while Samantha's face remained composed, though a flicker of something, panic, perhaps, crossed her eyes for a brief second. "What's going on, Jordan?" Mark asked, his tone a mix of confusion and concern. Jordan swallowed hard. His palms were sweaty, but he knew he had to stay strong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for everyone to see. "You can't marry her," Jordan said, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "She's not who she says she is. Her real name is Rebecca Myers, and she's been conning you this entire time." Gasps filled the garden as the guests began whispering among themselves. Mark's face went pale, and Samantha's eyes darted around the crowd, searching for an escape route. Mark shook his head, looking utterly bewildered. "Jordan, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous." "It's not," Jordan interrupted, his voice rising. "I've seen the proof. I found her IDs, her fake names. She's been lying to you, Dad. She's using you for your money. I even found records of your bank accounts, your investments. She's planning to take everything." Samantha's mask finally cracked. She stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Jordan, honey, I don't know where you're getting this information, but it's not true. You're just upset about the wedding. I get it. Change is hard for kids." Jordan ignored her, his eyes fixed on his father. "Dad, I recorded a conversation she had with some guy a few nights ago. They were talking about you, about how they were going to scam you after the wedding. I have the recording right here." He tapped on his phone, playing the audio for everyone to hear. The garden fell silent as Samantha's voice echoed through the speakers, discussing her plans to manipulate Mark's finances for the mysterious man. The guests looked on in shock, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Mark's face crumpled as the truth slowly sank in. He glanced at Samantha, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. "Samantha, is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha's expression twisted into one of cold fury. The facade of the sweet, caring fiancé melted away, revealing the real woman underneath. A calculating, ruthless con artist. She glared at Jordan, her eyes burning with hatred. "Fine," she spat, her voice venomous. "You want the truth? Yes, I was going to take everything. You're just like all the other idiots who think they can buy love with money. But you've got a smart little brat for a son, don't you?" The crowd gasped again, and Mark took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. His world was crumbling around him, and the woman he thought he loved had just admitted to being a fraud. Mark's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. I have to call the police," he stammered. This can't be happening." Samantha's eyes widened in panic as Mark dialed 911. "You're making a mistake," she hissed, taking a step toward him. But it was too late. Jordan stood tall, watching as his father finally realized the full extent of the betrayal. The police were on their way, and there was no way out for Samantha now. As Mark spoke to the dispatcher, the guests sat in stunned silence, watching as the dream wedding turned into a nightmare. Samantha backed away, her face pale as the sound of distant sirens grew louder. She turned to flee, but Jordan grabbed his father's hand, grounding him in the moment. "It's over, Dad," Jordan whispered. "She can't hurt us anymore." Mark nodded, tears in his eyes, as they both watched the woman who had nearly torn their lives apart be escorted away by the authorities. The garden, once brimming with excitement for the wedding, now felt frozen in time. The reality of Samantha's, or rather Rebecca's, deception hung heavy in the air, like a thick, suffocating fog. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to say or do as the facade of happiness shattered before their eyes. Mark stood motionless, his face drained of color, clutching his phone as the sounds of approaching sirens echoed in the distance. His hands trembled as he stared at the woman he had nearly married. No, the criminal he had let into his life. His heart ached with the weight of betrayal, the trust he had placed in her now reduced to ash. Jordan stood by his side, his heart still racing from his bold confrontation. He had done it. He had saved his father from making the worst mistake of his life. But now, as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in, he realized that the fight wasn't over yet. Samantha, or Rebecca, wasn't the type to go down without a fight. As Mark continued to speak shakily with the 911 dispatcher, Samantha's expression shifted. The cold fury that had flashed across her face moments earlier was replaced by something darker, panic. Her eyes darted around the garden, scanning the exits, and her body tensed as if preparing to flee. She knew that once the police arrived, it was all over. And Samantha wasn't the type of person to let herself be taken down so easily. The guests, still in shock from Jordan's revelations, began to murmur nervously as Samantha's erratic movements caught their attention. She glanced at the nearby gate, calculating the distance in her mind. Her breathing grew rapid, and a small, bitter smile crept across her lips as she realized her only option. Before anyone could react, Samantha bolted. The garden erupted into chaos. Guests gasped and stood up from their seats as Samantha sprinted toward the side gate, her wedding gown billowing behind her like a flag of surrender. She knocked over chairs in her path, sending flowers and decorations flying as she dashed past the shocked crowd. "Hey!" one of the guests shouted, but no one moved fast enough to stop her. Mark, still reeling from the betrayal, snapped out of his daze when he saw her running. "Samantha, stop," he yelled, but his voice was hoarse with emotion. His feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the shock of the day's events. He had just been moments away from marrying the woman, and now he watched her fleeing in panic, leaving behind the wreckage of their nearly intertwined lives. Jordan, however, wasn't paralyzed. His instincts kicked in immediately. "Dad, we have to go after her," he shouted, grabbing his father's arm. But Mark seemed frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Jordan didn't wait for his father to act. With his heart pounding, he broke into a run, chasing after Samantha as she fled through the side gate and out onto the street. His sneakers pounded against the pavement, and adrenaline surged through his veins. He couldn't let her get away, not after everything she had done. Samantha ran faster than Jordan had expected, her white wedding gown a stark contrast against the urban backdrop as she darted down the street. Her veil had slipped off, and her perfectly styled hair was now wild and disheveled. She didn't look like the elegant woman she had pretended to be. Now, she looked like what she truly was, a cornered criminal desperate to escape. Jordan's lungs burned as he sprinted after her, but he pushed himself harder, fueled by the fear of what she might do next. Samantha veered around a corner, disappearing from his sight for a moment. Panic surged in Jordan's chest. He had to catch her. As Jordan rounded the corner, he spotted her up ahead, ducking into an alleyway. His legs felt heavy, but he refused to stop. He was determined to see this through, to make sure she didn't slip away and vanish into the shadows like she had in her past cons. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, with dumpsters and discarded trash lining the walls. Samantha's breath was ragged as she slowed down, glancing over her shoulder to see if anyone was following. When she spotted Jordan, her eyes widened in fury. "Leave me alone, you little brat," she snarled, her voice sharp with desperation. Jordan stopped at the entrance of the alley, catching his breath. "You can't run forever," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The police are on their way. You're not going to get away with this." Samantha glared at him, her eyes wild. "You have no idea what you've done. You've ruined everything." Jordan shook his head, refusing to be intimidated. "No, I stopped you from ruining my dad's life. You're going to steal everything from him, just like you did to those other men." Samantha took a step closer, her fists clenched at her sides. "Your dad's a fool," she spat. "Just like the rest of them. He was easy to manipulate, too trusting, too blind. And you're just a kid. You should have kept your mouth shut." Jordan stood his ground, his heart hammering in his chest. "You can't hurt us anymore. It's over." Just then, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, echoing through the narrow alleyway. Samantha's eyes widened in panic, and she took another step back, glancing at the tall chain-link fence that blocked the other end of the alley. "No," she muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around frantically. "This can't be happening." Jordan watched as Samantha tried to climb the fence, her wedding dress snagging on the metal links. Her movements were frantic, desperate, and for a moment she looked almost pitiful, like a trapped animal with nowhere to go. She kicked at the fence, her hands clawing at the metal as she tried to hoist herself up, but the gown made it impossible. Suddenly, a police car screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, its lights flashing red and blue. 2 officers jumped out, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. "Stop! Get down from there!" Samantha froze, her fingers gripping the fence. She glanced back at the officers, then at Jordan, her expression a mix of fury and fear. She knew it was over. Slowly, Samantha lowered herself from the fence and turned to face the officers, her hands raised in surrender. The officers approached cautiously, their eyes never leaving her as they moved in to arrest her. Jordan watched as they placed her in handcuffs, his heart still racing, but a sense of relief washing over him. It was finally over. Rebecca had been caught. The woman who had nearly destroyed his family was now being led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed life of lies crumbling around her. As the police escorted her to the car, she cast one final, venomous glance at Jordan. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Mark my words, kid, this isn't over." Jordan didn't flinch. "It is for you." The officers led Samantha away, her words fading into the distance as they loaded her into the back of the police car. Jordan stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had done it. He had stopped her. After a few minutes, Mark appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and gratitude. He approached Jordan slowly, still trying to process everything that had unfolded in such a short span of time. "Jordan," Mark's voice was hoarse as he spoke, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on his son's shoulder. I don't know what to say." Jordan looked up at his father, his own emotions finally bubbling to the surface. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't want it to be like this, but I couldn't let her hurt you." Mark nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen it, but I was blind. I wanted to believe she was the one, that we could finally be a family again." Jordan's heart ached for his father, for the pain he was feeling. "It's not your fault, Dad. She fooled everyone. But we're okay now. We're going to be okay." Mark pulled Jordan into a tight hug, holding him close as the weight of the day's events finally began to lift. The The sirens, the lies, the betrayal, it all seemed to fade away as father and son stood together, stronger than ever. Samantha, now Rebecca Myers once again, sat in the back of the police car, her wrists bound tightly by cold metal handcuffs. Her once pristine wedding gown was torn and dirty, the train crumpled beneath her like a discarded rag. She stared out the window, her face a mask of fury and defeat, watching the streets blur as the car sped toward the police station. The weight of her failed con sat heavily on her shoulders, and the realization that her game was finally up gnawed at her insides. Back at the wedding venue, the guests were still trying to process what had just happened. Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd as people whispered about the dramatic events that had just unfolded. A wedding turned into a takedown of a con artist. None of them could have imagined such a twist. Some of the guests began to trickle away quietly, while others stayed behind, still shaken by the revelation that the woman they had believed to be Mark's loving fiancée was, in fact, a fraud. Jordan and Mark walked back toward the garden, where the remnants of the ceremony still stood, a stark reminder of what could have been. The arch of roses, the chairs, the aisle, all of it seemed surreal now. Just moments ago, it had been the setting for what was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but now it felt like the scene of a crime. Mark was still reeling. His mind was a blur of emotions: anger, shame, sadness. How had he let himself be so blind? He had nearly married a woman who had been planning to rob him of everything: his savings, his future, his trust. And if it weren't for Jordan, he would have fallen into her trap. "I can't believe I didn't see it," Mark muttered, more to himself than to Jordan. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression distant. "I let her into our lives. I trusted her with everything." Jordan, still feeling the weight of the confrontation, looked up at his father. "Dad, he didn't know. She was good at hiding it. But you have to remember that you were just looking for someone to love. You didn't do anything wrong." Mark nodded slowly, though the guilt still lingered in his eyes. "I should have listened to you sooner, Jordan. You saw things I didn't want to see. I'm sorry I didn't trust your instincts." Jordan shook his head. "It's okay, Dad. I just wanted to protect you, that's all." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them finally easing. Jordan had always looked up to his father as someone strong, someone who could handle anything. But now, in this vulnerable moment, Jordan realized that his dad wasn't invincible. He was human, just like everyone else. The police officers who had taken Samantha away returned to the house, and one of them approached Mark and Jordan. "Sir," the officer said, his tone serious but respectful, "we've taken Ms. Myers into custody. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a statement, and we'll also need to gather more information about the fraud she was planning." Mark nodded, his expression somber. "Of course, I'll do whatever you need." Jordan followed his father to the police station, the weight of the day's events still heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the image of Samantha's, Rebecca's, face when she had realized she was caught. The panic, the anger, the raw desperation. It had been both terrifying and satisfying to see her true self revealed in front of everyone. At the station, the police officers took statements from both Mark and Jordan, asking them to recount the events that had led to Rebecca's arrest. Jordan carefully explained everything: how he had overheard her conversation, how he had found the documents, and how he had pieced together the truth. Mark listened, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes as he realized just how much his son had done to protect him. Once their statements were taken, one of the detectives pulled Mark aside. "We've been investigating Rebecca Myers for a while," he explained, flipping through a file. "She's been connected to several similar cases in other states: wealthy men targeted in romance scams, their assets drained, and then she disappears. She's incredibly clever, and she's evaded capture for years. You're lucky your son caught on when he did." Mark's face darkened as the full extent of the deception sank in. "So she's done this before? To other people?" The detective nodded. "Yes, and she's very good at it. She knows how to play on people's emotions, how to manipulate them into trusting her. Once she has access to their finances, she empties everything. We're hoping to use the evidence you've provided to build a solid case against her. But it's not just about the money. There may be other crimes connected to her as well. Mark felt sick to his stomach. How close had he come to losing everything? And how many others had fallen victim to Rebecca's schemes before him? The detective's words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of how dangerous Samantha, Rebecca, had truly been. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, "for catching her and for protecting my son and me." The detective nodded, but his expression remained serious. "We'll do everything we can to make sure she's held accountable, but it's going to take time to untangle everything. She's been covering her tracks for years." As the police worked to process the evidence, Jordan and Mark sat in a quiet waiting area, the tension between them finally beginning to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan felt a sense of relief. They were safe now. The danger was over. But the emotional scars were still fresh. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, Jordan," Mark said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you better." Jordan looked up at his father, surprised by the raw emotion in his voice. "Dad, it's not your fault. You couldn't have known. She was really good at hiding who she was." Mark's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself be vulnerable in front of his son. "I just feel so stupid," he admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing, finding someone to share my life with. But I almost lost everything, and I could have lost you too." Jordan shook his head, his voice firm. "You didn't lose me, Dad. I'm here, and we're going to be okay." Mark pulled Jordan into a tight embrace, holding him close as tears of relief and gratitude streamed down his face. For the first time in months, Mark allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions, the fear, the sadness, the anger, and the overwhelming love he had for his son. After what felt like an eternity, they finally pulled apart, both of them wiping away their tears. Mark smiled faintly, though there was still a shadow of sadness in his eyes. "You're a brave kid, Jordan. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jordan shrugged, trying to downplay his role in the whole ordeal. "I just did what I had to do. I couldn't let her hurt you." As they sat together in the quiet room, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Rebecca Myers, the woman who had nearly destroyed their lives, was behind bars. It would take time to heal from the betrayal, but they had each other, and that was enough. The police eventually released them, letting them know they'd be in touch as the investigation progressed. Mark and Jordan left the station, stepping out into the cool evening air, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The night sky was clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan felt like he could breathe again. As they walked back to their car, Mark turned to Jordan. "How about we grab some takeout on the way home? I think we deserve a break after today." Jordan smiled, feeling a sense of normalcy return. "Yeah, that sounds good." They drove in silence for a while, the events of the day still fresh in their minds, but the tension between them had finally melted away. They were a team again, father and son, stronger for what they had been through. The days following Rebecca Myers' arrest were a blur of emotions, confusion, and slow healing. The police investigation into her past unraveled deeper layers of her crimes as they uncovered more victims scattered across different states. Wealthy men like Mark, who had been fooled by her charm and wit, only to be left financially and emotionally devastated. The headlines in the local news briefly focused on the dramatic wedding-turned-arrest, but soon the world moved on. For Mark and Jordan, however, the emotional scars remained fresh, and moving on wasn't so simple. Though Rebecca was now behind bars, awaiting trial, the aftermath of her deception lingered. Mark found himself replaying every interaction, every sweet word, and every tender moment they had shared, questioning how he could have missed the signs. Guilt clung to him like a second skin. But despite the darkness of those memories, something beautiful had emerged from the ordeal. Mark's relationship with Jordan had grown stronger than ever before. The father and son spent more time together, as Mark realized just how much he had taken Jordan's quiet presence for granted. They started rebuilding the bond that had frayed in the months leading up to the wedding. Mark's focus shifted from his romantic entanglements to something much more important, the well-being of his son. 2 weeks after the failed wedding, the house was eerily quiet. Gone were the lavish decorations, the wedding magazines strewn about the living room, and the constant calls from vendors. The house had been returned to its simple, comfortable state, much like how Mark and Jordan were trying to return to a semblance of normalcy. It was a Saturday morning, and Mark was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, his mind lost in thought. The smell of butter and syrup wafted through the house, but Mark's focus was elsewhere. He hadn't slept well since the day of the wedding, and each night he found himself haunted by Rebecca's face, her anger, her betrayal, her cold confession. Jordan shuffled into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He had been sleeping better than his father, but the weight of what they had gone through was still evident in his eyes. The confrontation at the wedding had forced him to mature quickly, to act beyond his years. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he was just a kid trying to find his footing again. Pancakes again? Jordan asked with a small smile, sitting down at the kitchen table. Mark looked over his shoulder and chuckled. "It's the one thing I can make without burning it. Thought you could use a good breakfast before we head out today." Jordan's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Head out? Where are we going?" Mark flipped another pancake onto the growing stack and turned to face his son. "I was thinking, we've both been through a lot lately. We need some time away from all of this." He gestured around the house, as if the very walls still held memories of Rebecca. "What do you think about a weekend trip? Just the two of us?" Jordan's face lit up for the first time in days. "Really? Where?" Mark smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been missing for weeks. "I was thinking we could head to that cabin we used to go to in the mountains. Remember? The one we went to after your mom passed. I think it's time we go back." Jordan's smile softened as he nodded. The cabin had always been a place of solace for them. A small, rustic getaway nestled in the woods, far away from the complications of life. It was where they had gone to heal after his mother's death, and it seemed fitting that they would return there now, after everything that had happened with Rebecca. "Yeah," Jordan said quietly. "I think that's a good idea." The healing process. The drive up to the cabin was long, but peaceful. The sun filtered through the tall trees as they wound their way through the mountain roads, the air fresh and crisp. Mark felt a sense of calm settle over him as they drove deeper into nature, leaving the city and its memories behind. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could finally breathe again. When they arrived at the cabin, it was just as they remembered it, cozy and secluded, with a small lake nearby and a view of the mountains that took their breath away. Jordan immediately ran to the edge of the lake, skipping rocks across the still water, while Mark unpacked their bags and set up a fire in the stone hearth inside. As the evening fell, they sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything but the wedding. They shared stories, laughed about old memories, and for a little while, it felt like the weight of the past weeks was lifting. But as the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, the conversation inevitably turned to what had happened. Mark stared into the flames, his face illuminated by the soft orange glow. "I keep thinking about her," he admitted quietly. "About how easily she fooled me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust someone like that again." Jordan, who had been lying on his back, staring up at the stars, sat up and looked at his father. "It's not about trusting someone else, Dad. It's about trusting yourself again." Mark looked over at his son, surprised by the wisdom in his words. "You didn't do anything wrong," Jordan continued, poking at the fire with a stick. "You were just looking for love. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to trust that next time, you'll know the difference between real love and someone pretending." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing his son's words. "How'd you get so smart?" he asked with a soft smile. Jordan shrugged, grinning. "I learned from the best." For the first time since Rebecca's arrest, Mark laughed. a genuine, hearty laugh that echoed through the quiet night. The sound felt like a release, like a door to the past was finally closing, and a new chapter was beginning. Rebecca's trial, months passed, and the day of Rebecca Meyer's trial finally arrived. Mark and Jordan didn't attend, but they followed the news closely. The case against her was strong, thanks to the evidence Jordan had uncovered. Along with testimonies from other victims, the prosecution was able to build a rock-solid case. Rebecca was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for her crimes, and her days of scamming innocent people were over. The news brought a sense of closure to both Mark and Jordan. Rebecca was out of their lives for good, and they could finally move forward without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over them. But the trial wasn't the end of their healing journey. Trust, as Jordan had wisely pointed out, wasn't something that could be restored overnight. Mark had learned a painful lesson about love and deception, and it would take time for him to open his heart again. Yet, with Jordan by his side, Mark knew that he didn't have to face the future alone. They had weathered the storm together, and their bond was stronger than ever. Looking toward the future, one day, as Mark and Jordan were sitting on the porch of their house, watching the sunset, Mark turned to his son with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about trusting myself again." Jordan glanced over, curious. "Yeah." Mark nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm not ready yet, but someday, I think I'll try again. Not with someone like Rebecca, but with someone real. Someone who'll appreciate both of us for who we are." Jordan smiled, relieved to hear that his father hadn't given up on the idea of love entirely. "You deserve that, Dad. We both do." Mark reached over and ruffled Jordan's hair, his heart full. "Thanks, kid, for everything." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. As they sat together, watching the day come to an end, there was a sense of peace between them, a peace that had been hard-earned but was all the more precious for it. Mark and Jordan had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side, and though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.